Chapter 16. The Physical Causes of Growth. Consider three portraits from Peter Menzel's book, Material World. Each one shows a family posed in front of its house, along with all of their household belongings. The pictures reveal stark differences in how average people live in different countries, from the affluence of Britain to the impoverishment of Albania, with many countries roughly in Mexico's position, in the middle. How do such differences arise? The basic answer is from differences in growth. Go back far enough, and almost everyone was living like modern Albanians, though without TV. Over time, some have progressed to the material comfort that most people in rich countries take for granted, while other societies put up with less, and others still experience severe, widespread poverty. This chapter is about the physical process of growth, what it is, and the physical things that need to happen in order for an economy to experience economic growth. The following chapter will pick up the social arrangements that encourage growth, and the chapter after that will look at the role of trade. For now, the first step is to identify what it is we're measuring when we talk about growth. Then we'll look at growth in the past and the different experiences of some countries in the modern world. From there, we'll turn to the standard growth cycle, the common explanation of how growth actually happens, before seeing how that story is modified through the inclusion of resources. Remember that GDP is the sum of all exchange value added in an economy, regardless of who owns it. And GNP is value added that is owned by people in our economy, regardless of where it's added. Usually, when we say economic growth, we mean an increase in GDP, or sometimes an increase in GNP. We're particularly interested in any increase in GDP or GNP per capita. If your economy starts producing twice as much as before, but your population has also doubled during that time, then that's not very exciting. Since GDP and GNP are both ways of counting up the creation of exchange value, it follows that an increase in GDP per capita is an increase in value added per capita. But also remember that underneath that flow of purchasing power that allows us to calculate the GDP, there's a physical flow of matter and energy. And for that physical process to increase, its production of value added, there has to be some change in the use of gradients, quite possibly an increase in the use of gradients. The things that allow this changed use of gradients are investment and technology, and the social structures or institutions that support their development and use. To get an overall sense of the range of wealth, look at GDP per capita around the world. Here's a sample of 186 countries, ranked from poorest to richest. We can divide the world's countries into three rough groups of rich, poor, and middle income. There's huge variation in wealth around the world, and that variation stands out more when you weight countries by their population. The differences become still more pronounced if you look closer to the level of individual people around the globe. Overall, there's a strong trend toward growth, which is evident in the history of GDP per capita in a number of rich countries. Even countries like the Czech Republic or Russia that had a hard time in the early 1990s after emerging from communism returned to economic growth after a few years. Many poor countries have also shown significant growth, such as Brazil, India, and most impressively, China. At the same time, not everyone has been successful, as can be seen in examples such as Ecuador, Zimbabwe, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where income fell to below $400 per person per year. But the overall trend is upward. This chart shows income per capita from 1952 to 2007 in countries that accounted for just about 80% of global population. You can see a similar pattern of per capita growth in countries that make up around 90% of the global population, or even among countries that cover just about the whole population, measured more recently. So far as we can tell, This growth history reaches back to the early 1800s, accelerating greatly after World War II. Looking further back, it appears there was very little growth globally until about 1500, before things accelerated somewhat during the early modern period, then sped up to just under 1% per year in the era of coal and steam, and then increased to 2% per year in the modern era of oil and the internal combustion engine. So what is it that separates this from this? On the physical level, it's the amount of capital and the technology embodied in that capital. If you go back far enough, everyone was farming by hand. A water buffalo and the plow that it pulls are both, in their way, technological innovations. A modern combine harvester is a much bigger piece of capital, involving several generations of additional technological change. The standard view of growth can be summed up in this list. First, there's saving and investment, because more capital makes workers more productive. There's also innovation, because better capital also makes workers more productive. Trade plays a role where each side concentrates on its relative strength, so it produces more and can save more. And there can be resource booms, such as periods of good farming weather, which increase output, allowing you to save and invest more. Our focus in this chapter is on the role of investment and innovation, and we can summarize that with a model of the growth cycle. We start with some capital, devices that help us produce output. We consume most of that output, but by definition, what we don't consume is our saving. Saving, in turn, is linked to investment. When you're investing, building new capital, you're also learning stuff along the way, what's known as learning by doing. In addition, humans are inherently inquisitive, so we figure out some stuff just because. Investment and innovation provide us with increased quantities of capital and better capital, which in turn allow us to increase output. The increased output funds increased saving, and the cycle continues. The standard depiction of the growth cycle isn't wrong, but it overlooks the role of resources. Specifically, it doesn't really pay attention to the role of resources in production. It also misses the influence that innovation and investment have on the availability of resources. It's easy enough to address those problems by modifying the standard growth cycle. We start with some stocks of potential resources, things that could be useful but aren't yet available to the economy. That could be oil in the ground where you don't yet have a well, or a forest with timber you could harvest but you don't yet have a railroad going through the forest. Some resources are currently available. The oil you can currently pump, the trees you can already reach. We also have some capital. To produce output, we operate our capital using inputs from the supply of available resources. This is the first key difference from the standard model. From there, however, the modified growth cycle proceeds much like the standard one, with consumption and saving that's linked to investment and innovation, both stuff that happens just because and the learning by doing kind. Investment and innovation lead to increased quantities of improved capital, and here's the second key difference from the standard approach. Because some of that increased improved capital is used to turn some of the stock of potential resources into available resources. We dig new coal mines, we drill new oil wells, we build railroads out to land that can be farmed. Investment and innovation don't create resources, but they do reach into the stock of potential resources and increase our supply of available resources. To close the loop, we operate our bigger, better machinery, drawing on that increased supply of available resources, and have increased output. From there, the cycle goes around again, just like in the standard model. When we add resources into the growth cycle, we don't entirely overturn the conventional view. It's still true that investment and innovation lead to growth. But some of that is about turning potential resources into available resources. When these investments and innovations are successful, we have more available resources to use in growth. Ironically, it turns out that as long as investment and innovation lead to increased availability of resources, we can ignore the role of resources. The interesting stuff happens when resources become limited, but we'll leave that aside for now. In the next chapter, we'll look at the social conditions that encourage the physical process of growth.